Did you know that there is actually a term called slave power, or rather, slaveocracy? That's a thing. Let's talk about it. The slave power, or slaveocracy, referred to the perceived disproportionate political power held by enslavers in the national government during the antebellum period. The term came from anti slavery campaigners. They claimed that this group of wealthy slaveholders had seized political control of their states and were trying to take over control of the federal government illegitimately to expand and protect slavery. Not so fun fact, they weren't wrong. Can someone tell me how these wealthy enslavers had become so powerful? Yes, slavery's protections were written into the Constitution. That's one. What's number two? I heard somebody say three-fifths clause, and you'd be correct. Southern power came from the three-fifths clause, counting 100 slaves as 60 people for seats in the House, and thus for electoral votes, gave the South disproportionate representation at the national level. This was written into the Constitution as well. So, if anyone, including a Northerner, wanted to get anywhere or wanted to get something done, they usually had to make a deal with the devil, and that devil was in the South, giving them an inordinate amount of power. This would actually continue even after slavery ended. Anybody heard of the term Southern Bloc, which would last until Truman and the Dixiecrats in 1948? I'm oversimplifying, but you get the point. Anti-slavery factions, not abolitionists, were distrustful of the enslaving class. Those who differed on many other issues could unite to attack the slaveocracy. For instance, the Free Soil movement emphasized that rich enslavers would move into new territory, use their cash to buy up all the good lands, then use enslaved people to work the lands, leaving little opportunity for free farmers. In 1958, Lincoln gave a speech and he charged Senator Stephen Douglas, President James Buchanan, his predecessor Franklin Pierce, and Chief Justice Roger Taney as being part of a plot to nationalize slavery, as allegedly proven by the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision. You know, that ruling where Taney said that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional and that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories, which would have allowed for the spread of slavery into the West. Republicans argued that slavery was economically inefficient compared to free labor and was a deterrent to the long term modernization of America. They were right. They were also troubled by the fact that the slave power was systematically seizing control of the White House, the Congress, and the Supreme Court, which is how Justice Roger Taney could be like, blacks aren't citizens and don't have rights that whites have to abide by. And President James Buchanan could be all, well, what are you going to do? The existence of a slave power was dismissed by Southerners and rejected by many historians of the 1920s and the 1930s, but I don't know why they rejected it. A basic understanding of history shows you that slaveocracy existed. It was an enslaver that wrote the Constitution. The father of the Constitution, James Madison, owned 36 enslaved people when he passed away, and he wrote the protections for slavery into the Constitution. Granted, you can argue that it was to get a buy-in from South Carolina, but everybody has options. And we can't forget that 12 of the first 16 presidents owned enslaved people. The first 4 presidents came from Virginia, the OG slave state, the state that conferred slave status based on the mother. Virginia was the first state to enact slave codes. Slave codes that became black codes, that became segregation laws. It was enslavers who wrote the Fugitive Slave Act, making an entire country complicit in turning over enslaved black people back to their owners when they just wanted freedom. And over the course of 15 presidents, it had dispossessed the Native Americans from their own land. And we started a war, on the word of a president, James K. Polk, for the expansion of slavery. And let's not forget that the South lost their shit when a real threat, Abraham Lincoln, arrived on the scene. Laws were made solely based on the idea of slavery. Land was purchased because of slavery. It wasn't perceived political power, and it shouldn't be dismissed. It was an actuality. I really wish people stopped downplaying and reframing history and told the truth about what was. Slave power was real, and it ran this country until it didn't. Not so fun fact. I do want to call out some conspiracies attributed to the slave power. In 1864, a writer named John Smith Dye alleged that in 1835, former Vice President John C. Calhoun, outraged by Andrew Jackson's opposition to states' rights and nullification, encouraged a deranged man to unalive the president. The plot failed when the man's pistol misfired. He maintains that in 1841, agents of the slave power poisoned President William Henry Harrison with arsenic just 30 days after he took office because he refused to cooperate with a Southern scheme to annex Texas. This left John Tyler, a defender of slavery, in the White House. In 1850, President Zachary Taylor, a Louisiana slaveholder who had commanded American troops in the Mexican War, alienated the slave power by opposing the extension of slavery into California. Just 16 months after taking office, the slave power used arsenic to unalive the president. He was succeeded by Vice President Millard Fillmore, who was more sympathetic to the Southern cause. In 1853, Dye claimed agents of the slave power derailed Franklin Pierce's railroad car while the president-elect was on the way to the presidential inauguration. The New Hampshire Democrat and his wife escaped injury, but their 12-year-old son was unalived. In the future, Pierce towed the Southern line. On February 23, 1857, President-elect James Buchanan, a Pennsylvania Democrat and leading politician, dined at Washington's National Hotel. Dye charged that Southern agents sprinkled arsenic on the lump of sugar used by Northerners to sweeten their tea. Because Southerners drank coffee and used granulated sugar, no Southerners were injured. But according to Dye, 60 Northerners were poisoned, including the president, and 38 passed away. There's no credible evidence supporting any of John Smith Dye's sensational allegations, but I did want to let you know that there were conspiracy theories associated with slave power.